Pray with me. Lord, may the words of my mouth, the meditations of my heart bring you glory. Amen. Please be seated. We have today several stories in our readings in which people are facing adversities and storms in which they respond in very different ways. Reading through them, I am reminded of an old story about God's providence in the form of two boats and a helicopter. Many of you may have heard this story before, I'm sure. Bob was a good and faithful Christian, had been all his life. He had been raised in the church. He and his late wife had raised their kids in the church to be adults of faith. He had always served on various committees, helped out at the food kitchen, did everything right, gave generously during pledge week. He was just a good and faithful servant. Unfortunately, Bob was not always all that prudent when it came to more worldly things. Bob lived in an area that was prone to flooding. Most years it was not too bad, but one year it was going to be bad. Meteorologists were calling it a 500-year flood. The governor declared a state of emergency and sent the Red Cross and the National Guard in to help. Local authorities encouraged everybody to evacuate, and most people did, but not Bob. He was a good and faithful servant and had always trusted God to protect him in times of adversity. As Bob sat there on his front porch watching the waters rise, just as they were getting right up to his porch, here comes a motorboat with a couple guys in it. "Say, fella, hop in. We'll get you to safety." "No thanks," said Bob. "God will protect me." "Okay, suit yourself." And they went about their business to go help the next person. Well, the waters continued to rise and completely inundated the entire first floor of his house. So he climbed up to the second floor. And as he sat there on the balcony watching the waters continue to rise, here comes another boat, pulled right up to his balcony. "Say, fella, hop in. We'll get you to safety." "No thanks," Bob said. "God will protect me." So they went on their way to go help the next person. Well, the waters continued to rise. Bob had to climb up into his attic and ultimately up into the top of his roof. And as he stood there in the very pinnacle of his roof with just a few feet of space left, here comes a helicopter. Helicopter hovers above him, the door opens up, rope gets thrown out, guy leans out with a bullhorn. "Say, fella, grab a hold of the rope. We'll pull you up to safety, and we'll get you taken care of." "No thanks, Bob," said Bob. "I'm good. God will save me." Well, the waters continued to rise, and Bob did not fare so well. As he stood there at the pearly gates in heaven, talking to God and being welcomed into heaven, he just had to ask one question of God. "God," he said, "I've been a good and faithful servant all my life. I've done everything right. I've been in the church. I raised my kids in the faith. I help out in the community. I've done everything right. I was depending on you to save me down there in that storm, but, here I am. What's going on?" God looked at him and said, "Well, Bob, I did send you two boats and a helicopter." The point of the story is that we are all going to face adversities and storms and floods and everything else in life. And God will always provide us with the means to get through those storms, those adversities. Our job is to trust God and to trust in the resources He has given us and to be proactive in using those resources to get through those adversities. How are we to use those resources? Are we supposed to be proactive, reactive, or inactive? How do these work out for us? Bob demonstrated a solid faith, but he was not very proactive in trusting God and the resources that God sent in the form of those two boats and that helicopter. Today in our readings, we have several stories. We have a couple of stories of people responding to adversities in their lives in a couple of different forms. And each one of the three people responds very differently. At one end of the spectrum, we have a person who responds very, very well. Trusts God, trusts his own abilities that God had developed in him, knew he could handle the situation. At the other end of the spectrum, we have another person who responds to the exact same adversity by not responding at all. just shutting down. And then we have a story that's somewhere in between. Our first story comes from 1 Samuel, one of the most famous stories in the Bible, 1 Samuel 17, the classic story of David and Goliath. Every school child knows it. We've heard it all of our lives. So let's look at that. David was the youngest son of Jesse. He had 7 or 8 older brothers. David's older brothers were all serving in the army, but David was not quite of fighting age yet. So he was helping out at the house by tending his father's sheep. And one day, as the troops were out fighting the Philistines, Jesse sent David with a care package to go see his brothers and to take this care package to them. David got out to the lines just as the troops were moving out for the day. Philistines on one side of the valley and the Israelites on the other side. And out from the Philistine army steps Goliath. Well, what do we know about Goliath? He was an experienced warrior, a giant of a man. I'm sure he had a reputation all over the region as being a big, huge, experienced fighter that you do not want to run into. We are told earlier in the chapter that Goliath stood 6 cubits and a span. If you ever wondered what a cubit is, well, if you bend your arm, the distance from the tip of your elbow to the tip of your middle finger is a cubit. It kind of got standardized at about 18 inches or so, about 1.5 feet. Goliath is 6 cubits, according to the story, in the span. So 6 cubits times 1.5 feet would be 9 feet, plus a span, which is if you spread out your hand, the distance from the tip of your thumb to the tip of your pinky, about 8 inches. So according to the story, Goliath is 9'8", a pretty big dude. Just to give you some context, if those of you who have been watching the basketball finals and the Mavs lately, that basketball hoop is right at 10 feet above the floor. Goliath could stand there and just dunk basketballs all day long without even lifting a foot. That's how tall he was, according to the story. His armor weighed 5,000 shekels, and his helmet another 600 shekels. Well, about 50 shekels to the pound, so he had on better than 100 pounds worth of armor. So a pretty big dude. Not somebody you would want to face on a battlefield. And he's probably well armed, and he knows how to use all those cool toys that he has. So the Israelites and the Philistine armies were lined up on opposite sides of the field. Every morning and every evening, Goliath would come out and give his spiel, challenging the Israelite army to send somebody out to fight him in single combat, one-on-one, winner take all. None of the Israelites, despite the fact that they were all experienced warriors themselves, and wanted to accept Goliath's challenge. More importantly, Saul made no effort to resolve the situation. He wasn't calling for volunteers. He wasn't giving a big rousing speech. He just sort of sat in his tent for weeks on end while Goliath came out and taunted his armies. After many days of the standoff, David arrived with his care package for his brothers and immediately sees what's going on, just as Goliath is stepping out to give his spiel. David's response was to immediately go to Saul and tell him that he wants to take on this giant. Now, Saul was kind of skeptical. Here's this scrawny little kid, just a young teenager, literally fresh off the farm, wanting to go out and fight against this 9', 8 inch tall, grizzled old war veteran who was a skilled warrior and knew what he was doing. Saul was very skeptical. David had to explain to Saul that he had lots of experience tending his family's sheep, that he often had to fight off animals, lions and tigers and bears, oh my. And he had to fight these off to protect his sheep. And that occasionally one of those animals would persist and he would have to kill that bear or that lion with his bare hands. And if he can do that, Goliath's not a problem. He can take Goliath easy. So, wearing no armor, carrying only a staff, a slingshot, and a few stones from the creek behind him, David went out and confronted Goliath and was bold about it. He was bold about it. Goliath kind of responded about the same way that Saul did, was very skeptical. Am I a dog, Goliath said, that you come to me with sticks? Come to me, and I will give you your flesh to the birds of the air and to the wild animals of the field. David responded to Goliath's words from a place of great faith, great confidence, great courage. You come to me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have divided. This very day the Lord will deliver you into my hand. At that point, David and Goliath charge each other. David pulls out a stone from his pouch, puts it in a slingshot, one shot, right smack into Goliath's forehead. Goliath fell. The Israel army charged and quickly defeated the Philistine army. So thus, our first two examples of how people respond to the exact same adversity in the form of Goliath. At one of the end of the spectrum, we have Saul. Saul, for days and days and weeks, just shut down, did not do anything. He had the entire Israelite army at his command. He could have called for volunteers. He could have picked someone to go out and fight. He could have given that big rousing speech that we've all seen in sports movies in the fourth quarter. But he did not. He did nothing. At the other end of the spectrum, we have David. David, despite being a young teenager with absolutely no military experience, he stepped out and accepted Goliath's challenge. He volunteered eagerly to fight the giant, trusting that God would be with him as he fights Goliath, and trusting in the skills that he had developed tending to his family's sheep. So those are two examples. Two ends of the opposite ends of the spectrum. Our gospel reading provides a third example that's somewhere in between. At the end, Jesus and the disciples had been along the shore of the lake teaching all day. Evening comes around and Jesus tells them that they need to go to the other side. So they all climb into the boat and they start paddling across the water. Night falls. Jesus is sleeping on the cushion in the back of the boat. In the meantime, the disciples, many of them experienced fishermen who had been out on the lake many times, probably in horrible weather a few times. So while they're out in the middle of the lake, this big, huge, massive windstorm blows up. Now about that windstorm. We live here at the southern end of Tornado Alley. This time of year, every year we're used to big storms coming through town. Sometimes we get a really exceptionally large storm like we did a couple of weeks ago. Straight line winds, tons of rain. It always knocks down trees, rips roofs off houses. They're pretty intense. We've all been through those, and you can imagine how disconcerting going through one of those storms is inside of your well-built modern house in an interior room that you trust is going to be safe in that storm. Now imagine going through that storm on a dinky little rowboat out in the middle of the lake with no land in sight. I think I would probably be every bit as terrified as the disciples were under that situation. So several of the disciples, despite being professional fishermen, were afraid for their lives because of the storm. Again, they knew how to handle these boats. They'd been in this weather before. They had other boats around them. They had resources that God had provided them with that they could use in this situation of adversity. But they panic. They know that Jesus will save them. They at least have that much faith, and they know that they need to do something. They have at least that much prudence. So they go to Jesus, wake him up, and ask him for Jesus' help to protect them from the storm. He, of course, does that, calms the seas, calms the wind, and the disciples make it through the storm. I think they responded better than Saul did. Saul just shut down, but the disciples at least did something. We are all going to face these storms in our lives, and we have all been given the resources that we need, or will be given the resources we need to handle those situations that we will face. But how are we to respond? Are we to trust God and trust those resources and be proactive like David was? Are we to just shut down like Saul? Or will we probably react more like the disciples did? I think probably that third. But how do we get from that point to more trusting in God like David was? The history of the church provides us with many examples of saints throughout the years of the church's history who have responded well in times of distress. That's why they made saints, to be examples to us of how to respond. Yesterday, June the 22nd, was the feast day of St. Alban. Living in Roman Britain in the late 2nd and early 3rd century, Alban became the first British saint. Now, the Roman government that was controlling this area at the time had its own mandatory state religion with its hodgepodge of various gods that Roman citizens were expected to worship. One day, Alban encountered a Roman Catholic priest who was fleeing the local Roman authorities, having refused to convert to the official state religion. Alban took this priest into his own home, protected him, fed him, cared for him. Under this priest's influence, Alban came to faith in God and became a Christian himself. Inevitably, Roman officials showed up at Alban's front door looking for this priest so that they could arrest him. Instead of turning over this priest to them, he had enough of a sense of justice to know that this priest did not deserve to die, so Alban turned himself in, claiming to be that priest that they were looking for. They questioned him extensively and severely, and eventually came to the conclusion that this was not the man they were looking for, that Alban was still hiding that priest. To punish Alban for hiding that priest, they sentenced him to all the punishments that priest would have received: scourging, ultimately death, all sorts of torture. It was not a good thing. Alban, though, protected the priest. He had the prudence to decide what to do in that situation and enough of a sense of justice to protect that priest. He reacted well. So, where else can we look when facing adversity? Along with our faith and our trust in God and our trust in the resources that God has given us, and along with the examples throughout church history and the examples listed in the Bible of how people react, we have the traditional cardinal virtues. We have prudence, the ability to discern right course of action. David had that kind of prudence. Alban had that kind of prudence. Saul and the disciples, maybe not so much so. We also have the cardinal virtue of justice, a sense of fairness or righteousness. Alban displayed that in great wealth as he protected that priest. Then we have fortitude, the ability to confront fear. The disciples did not do very well at that, but David did wonderfully at that. He's the prime example of fortitude in a bad situation. And then there's temperance, restraint, or self-control, the ability to not do the wrong thing. These four virtues are in addition to the virtues that you find throughout the Bible, especially in the epistles of Paul. We heard some of them listed in today's reading. These do not come naturally to most of us. They have to be developed over time and through hard experience. The people in our example exercise or fail to exercise each of these virtues. Like I said, David and Alban each demonstrated holiness of spirit as well as genuine love. They were prudent and courageous and sought justice. Each of these men trusted God and relied on the power of God to protect them. Saul, on the other hand, exercised none of these virtues. He was not prudent. He did not seek out any course of action to move forward. He had no sense of justice or fairness to guide him. So he certainly did not exhibit courage or fortitude as he sat by and did nothing. He didn't exhibit faith, nor did he act proactively. What about the disciples in the boat? Their courage might have failed them, but they had enough prudence to know that something needed to be done. Their faith, like Alban's, was new and undeveloped. They didn't quite trust in their own abilities that God had given them to handle that situation. But they did trust that Jesus would be able to save them. They were proactive in going to Jesus for help. Their worst failing was that they simply did not know what to do on their own in this moment. Their sense of prudence and fortitude were not yet fully developed. So today we've looked at several examples of people facing adversity. David and Alban proactively take action and do so in faith in the God of all creation. Jesus' disciples, on the other hand, were proactive in turning to Jesus for help, but their faith was new and not yet fully developed. Finally, Saul does nothing. He is neither faithful nor proactive. Faith takes many years to grow to maturity. Sometimes this growth is slow and steady. Sometimes it grows in leaps and bounds, especially when we face the adversities that we inevitably face in our lives that help to grow these traits in us. We have to learn those lessons the hard way, but we learn them well when we do. We need to be proactive as we face our giants. As Saul found out, Goliath did not go away simply because he failed to respond. We need to take action to deal with the giants in our life. This action needs to be vetted by the virtues we learn as our faith grows. Oftentimes, we learn these lessons the hard way. This can be the best teacher of all, but they must be learned. May God teach us and guide us on the path that he has set for us, and may we become faithful people he wants us to be. Amen.